Okay, good morning, everybody.
Morning, Matt.
Come on, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Yes, you're awake. Welcome to day 2 of VMworld, and thank you for attending Horizon View Troubleshooting. My name's Matt Coppinger. I'm an end-user compute architect in our end-user compute business unit. I've been working with View now since its inception. In fact, I worked on the original VDM 2.0 product in R&D, and I've been working with the product and deploying it with customers in Europe, Middle East, and Africa since then, since 2008. So I have, I'd like to think that I've walked in your shoes a little bit. I've deployed the product and had to troubleshoot it over the years. So hopefully some of the information we have today will be of use to you.
And I'm Jack McMichael. I've been at VMware for 3.5 years or so now, but I actually started in our GSS Global Support Services, so many of you might have talked to me at one point, and moved over to View R&D, and now I'm an architect and end-user computing business unit as well. So a lot of experience with View from your side and from ours, so a lot of things to share.
So let's talk a little bit about the presentation today. We have quite a bit of reference information in here, so the slides are quite text heavy. You don't need to take photographs of them. You'll get the slides after VMworld. You have access to them, but the content is quite technical and a little dry. There are no face melting demos, so apologies for that. But yeah, there's lots of information here that you'll refer back to as you use the deck and to help you troubleshoot your View environment as you go. Just as a show of hands, how many of you have deployed Horizon View today? Okay, great. Every year we get more and more people put their hand up, which is fantastic. So let's just jump straight in. The typical kind of disclaimer, I won't be mentioning any kind of future features or development. There's a few people at the front to keep me in check here, but I might add the odd thing, but obviously no promises there. Okay, so the agenda, we're going to look at some of the common issues that you can see whilst operating a View environment. We'll look at what can go wrong, and then we'll break those issues down into 4 problem domains and talk about how you can find out what's going wrong in each of those domains and some of the common fixes. And then finally we'll cover resources that are available to you, tools and things like that you can use to help troubleshoot. One of the things we like to do each year for this session is to talk to our global support organization and say, what are the top 6 issues that you see? What are the most common support requests that you get around View? So this is really for people kind of contemplating deploying or have just deployed View, the kind of things that you're likely to see. And the top one there really is SSL. We introduced some changes to the way we handle SSL certificates in the latest versions of View, and some of our customers have had some issues in dealing with that. So we've actually put in place a couple of KB articles and white papers on explaining how to set up SSL certificates in a Horizon View environment, and Jack will talk a little bit more about that later. View persona is also a common kind of issue that we trip over. The common issue here is that you need to set permissions correctly when setting up View persona, and we have a great KB article there that you can reference to make sure you don't fall into that trap. I guess some of the most common problems, though, in a View environment really is around infrastructure. And this is kind of typically ESX storage performance. And most of these issues are actually usually caused by the fact that people have not optimized their virtual desktop image. So we've done a lot around publishing guides on how to optimize both Windows XP and Windows 7. So we recommend that you create a new VM, use those optimization guides to reduce the kind of CPU, memory, disk footprint of your desktop image. So please don't P2V physical desktops in the real world into your View environment. Make sure you are creating a clean parent VM using our guides. The 4th one there is about connectivity, and we do have some extensive kind of networking requirements. They do tend to change now and then, so you need to make sure you're familiar with the port requirements for View and our remote protocols, and actually the port requirements in between the individual components. And then finally, PC over IP. I think when PC over IP first came out, it was a kind of bit of a dark art on how to tune it. We've improved our enablement of how to troubleshoot and tune PC over IP. So a number of sizing guides and things that you can do. Now specifically I'm going to call out Andre Libovici's brilliant blog, myvirtualcloud.net. If you haven't heard of that before, you should absolutely be looking at that blog. And he's actually got a sizing calculator for PCRIP that we typically use in PSO and SE to do some kind of guidelines and sizing on bandwidth for PCRIP sessions. And then also one of the guys in our office of the CTO, Chuck Herstius, has a wonderful log viewer for PC over IP that takes the very text-based logs that we create for PC over IP and converts them into kind of visual graphs. So you can actually see if your PC over IP session is suffering from, packet loss, network latency, or bandwidth issues. And that's mindfluxinc.net is Chuck's website where you can download his PC over IP log viewer tool.
So as Matt mentioned, one of the top issues over and over and over again, SSL, and that's why we say SSL, SSL, SSL. Number one call we get about a customer's setting a new environment, or maybe it's an old environment that you've had for a while, and now you're deciding to go from the built-in VMware certificate to your own certificate. You maybe have a need for external facing users to be able to get in, and they want a secure certificate that shows them you own the certificate. So we've outlined the process of how you actually generate a certificate for your environment. It's very easy when it comes down to it, but a lot of customers have difficulty with this process because it can be a bit of a text heavy read. We have some great documentation we'll pull up here in a second to give you a link on where to go get it. But this is just a basic outline of the process. And the first and foremost rule of setting up SSL, make sure you read the manual, because there are some real key things that you need to make sure that you're doing when you create this, your config, and when you create your CSR. There's a lot of pitfalls and gotchas that if you don't have it set up correctly, the process isn't going to work. You may get a valid cert, but it's not going to work when you plug it into the View environment. So we've put a general guide here on the steps. Some of the things like when you actually generate your CSR, you need to make sure it's exportable. Make sure your private key is exportable and that it's in there. People forget that part of the process. If you don't do that, then it's not going to work when you plug it in. So make sure to read the documentation and really go through. We have a great community site where people run into this all the time. There's a lot of good guidance on how to actually go through this setup. So I highly encourage you to read the manual, ask lots of questions. But if you set it up right the first time, it's one of those things that you can get it in and get it done with, and you're good. So big pitfall for a lot of customers. Make sure you go through that. And here's a documentation I highly recommend anyone whether you already set up your View environment or whether you're about to, make sure you read this document. It's good to know for that time, because more than likely, if you have an existing View environment, your private certificate, the self-generated one, it will expire at some point, and you will need to go through that process. And that's often what catches a lot of customers. They get caught off guard, and then I don't know what I'm doing, and production is down, and these kinds of things. So make sure you read this document. It will get you. Sorry. It will get you through a lot of the pitfalls with setting up SSL. Are you awake now?
Excuse me, guys. Sorry about that. So we also talked about network connectivity, and so here is an example of all of the kind of ports required for a Horizon View deployment. So you can see here from our clients, we can connect over HTTPS, HTTP, PC over IP into our View security server or View connection server, and then notice some of the port requirements in between the individual components there. So some of the things that we like to point out is in the latest versions of View, we've introduced the ability to place View Composer on a standalone VM, so it's no longer has to be installed with vCenter Server. And that's not actually placed on, View Composer is not actually highlighted on this diagram. But one of the lessons we've learned is that View Composer actually needs direct access to the ESX hosts. So if that's not on the correct management network, you may have some provisioning issues. So make sure that if you do install View Composer on a standalone VM, it has access to ESX over port 902.
Does anyone else notice something that's missing from this graphic? There's actually a connection in the latest version of View that's not on here. Does anyone happen to know it? Shout it out. No. App Blast. So think about as we continue to add things to the View, we have a plug-in type architecture where we can add things. We start expanding the feature set of the software. It's important to make note of the release notes. When we release new versions of View, things change. We have changed the PC over IP port, before. We have it set to a standard now. It shouldn't change again. But it's important to know that there's a lot of connections in View, and so paying attention to these types of maps in terms of where all the connections are being made, and as we release new versions, making sure you keep note of any changes or additions that you might need to consider for your network guys, your firewall rules, things like that. So there's a lot of connections, always keep track of those.
So some of the other issues that we've seen in the environment is around sizing the View brokers. Jack, I don't know if you want to kind of jump into some of these, some of the things that you've seen.
Sure. So from a broker sizing perspective, one of the biggest issues that I see with customers when they're setting up is they start with a proof of concept. You have one server, you're just trying out the product, and then from there you want to go ahead and move into a full deployment. Well, if you size your broker incorrectly, you can really lead to some problems down the line, and what people forget to do is to make sure and adjust the memory, and adjust the Java heap to accommodate for a larger size scale. So making sure that you set up your broker correctly from the very beginning is important, and I recommend even from a POC standpoint to make sure that you have the appropriate amount of memory so that the Java heap is set correctly from the very beginning. We see a lot of latency issues. Sometimes when people don't take into account the amount of brokers that you need in an environment. So we always recommend that you size it from the beginning, of course, and from a vCPU standpoint, you can always have more. Now, from a minimum standpoint, we say 2, but there are occasions where as we add things such as App Blast, you're going to have more consumption. So consider, even though we give minimum guidance, always keep an eye on your resource consumption from a broker's perspective, and don't be afraid to add more memory to make sure that you have peak performance for those peak usage times. When the JMS protocol that we use to communicate amongst all the brokers is very busy, and we have a lot of things going on, a lot of connections being made, resources can be used, and it's important to make sure that you're able to accommodate all your users and that connections are not being dropped. So the bottom line, make sure you size your broker correctly from the beginning.
I think the key takeaway is that when you install the View connection server, that is when the Java heap sizes are set.
Right.
So you need to make sure that you've got the correct amount of RAM configured on the connection server VM before installing View. If you then adjust the amount of RAM allocated to that VM after install, View will not use it because it's already configured the Java heap size. So we've got some guidance on kb.vmware.com which will tell you how to adjust that Java heap size post-install of View connection server. So just be aware of that. So let's talk about some of the troubleshooting keys. Now hopefully all of you are familiar with the View Administrator dashboard, and we won't really be covering that in too much detail today. But obviously this is the first place that you can go to see if there are any particular issues in the environment. Specifically on this picture here, can anyone tell me what they think the issue might be? There's a red on the connection server. This is a default install. Anyone? Exactly. So you haven't installed a custom SSL certificate. So if you just install View out of the box and you're using the default SSL certificate that we ship with it, you will get a red box for a connection server there. So just be aware of that when you do your default install. It's not broken, it's just the fact that you haven't applied your SSL certificate to it. But essentially the View Administrator Console is the first place to go when checking on the health of the environment. The second thing we like to do is we like to make sure that everyone understands the client connection process. So what actually is happening in the environment, which components are used, which log events are happening when a client connects to a View connection server, they get allocated a desktop and connect to that particular VM. And we're going to actually walk you through that connection process and all the logging events and everything like that today, so make sure you're clear on that. You can also adjust the logging level on the connection servers to get some more debug, a bit more of a verbose logging on the logs, which will help you, troubleshoot and understand what's going on in the environment. But essentially, what we're going to be talking about today is diving into the logs and showing you some of the key events and how you can correlate those events to track and trace and see what's going on in the environment. And we do this by essentially matching and filtering session IDs, user IDs, and other information across the logs on the different components. And we'll take you through how to do that. But finally, of course, we've got some wonderful articles on kb.vmware.com. So our global support team, what they do is as the support requests come in, as they see trends and common issues, they start to document the issues and the fixes for those. So almost all of the common problems are documented, and the fixes are documented on the knowledge base website.
So as Matt was suggesting, when you set the logging levels on your connection broker, you can get very little or a whole lot of information. So one of the tools that we recommend, and we don't specifically recommend any particular tool, but this happens to be one that we use internally, and I believe there's others out there. This one's called Beartail and BearGrep. They're fairly inexpensive software you can get out there, and for those of you familiar with Linux, it's essentially the same tool but for Windows. And because View lives in a Windows world, this is a tool that we can use to actually go through our logs. A lot of people get overwhelmed when they look at our logs because they're full of a lot of information. So we have a video we're going to show here in a second, but I just want to give you kind of a quick screenshot of what the software looks like and how you can actually pull in a log and start to parse through the information. Do you want to go ahead and play that?
Yep.
So this is a little video that I made in my personal demo environment. Is that playing? Yeah, there we go. So I put a couple notes here at the bottom just to let you know the process of how you would actually open a log and start bringing information. I'm going to open up the most recent debug log for a View connection server that I have. We're going to open it up. We'll do that. There we go. Now, one of the key things you can do is you can filter at the bottom or you can filter in line. So the highlighting and the filtering that you can use with this tool makes it absolutely easy compared to just looking in Notepad for finding an event. In this case, let me get up here so I can see. In this case, we're adding highlights to a particular session or a particular user or a particular event. So I think I'm going to add my name. So I can put my name, I can put a highlight color, and now all of a sudden, if I log into the View environment, you'll see some events scroll by. And so if you just need to track an issue as it's happening, this is a great way to take a live look. Now you see I logged into the broker, it's popping up, it's really drawing my attention to that. And if I need to grab all those events, I can type my name at the bottom. Now I have a list of all those that are pulled out in a very consolidated form that I can copy, I can paste them into something else. This is an invaluable tool whether you're just trying to debug the issue yourself or whether you're trying to call our global support and get some help from them to really be able to get the relevant information that you need to debug an issue. So as you can see, I'm going through and I grab one of the events that I've logged on with, and I'm grabbing the session ID. Now we obscure in the latest versions of View, that's why you see the asterisks. But I'm going to take that session ID and I'm going to add a filter for it because not all events are going to have your username. Some are only going to have a session ID. And you can use that and add a secondary filter. So I've changed the highlight to the session, and I'm going to add a second filter, I believe, for my name. So I can see the various events. There we go. Now, as these happen again, I see these events, and you can add virtually as many as you want, and it just becomes a very, very great tool to see a clear picture of what's happening in your View environment as it's happening. And so between the filter and the highlighting, this is an invaluable tool that I highly recommend everyone use if you're an administrator or if you're just really having trouble with your View environment. Before you call or even during the call, this can really get you the information you need.
So I think the logs can actually be quite intimidating when you first open them, and hopefully the session today will take you through the logs and some of the key events, so it makes it a little bit easier for you to understand what's going on and do this kind of troubleshooting. So you can go into Beartail, you can look at the logs and pick out some of the key events. And I think you'll find that as you use this type of tool, it becomes very clear what kind of events you're looking for. In this particular, I think I'm actually starting to do an on event. So this is a common thing that you can look for. If you look for the keyword on event, you'll see on event connecting, on event pending. Some of these events that are particular to a connection event, they are going to be logged, and so you find that you can start finding an actual connection process, and as you pick through those lines,
you'll see commonalities that then you can add filters for, and it becomes easy to find those problems as you start kind of learning the keywords to look for. And with a tool like this, you can actually do that. With your Notepad, it's virtually impossible to really pick out what you're looking for. It's just an information overload.
So let's quickly talk about some of the common problems you'll see. It could be anything from a user can't even connect to View, you get randomly disconnected, you have a poor PCROP or display experience, you get that kind of famous, desktop not available, contact your sysadmin error event, or maybe even that there might be something you're seeing in the View broker itself, an error or such, or maybe it's something around vCenter or even a performance issue. So those are the kind of common issues that we'll see or we see that get reported. So just as a level set, let's just make sure that everyone is familiar with the kind of general high-level overview, architecture of View and the different components. So we like to break View down into these different areas: the View client, the network, the View connection server or manager, View Composer, which is doing a lot of our provisioning, obviously the vCenter server, ESX hosts, and then your storage. And this is really the kind of individual components that we will actually look at to see where the problems lie. So we break them down into these problem domains. And the first one really is around View client connectivity issues. So this could be something such as, the View client can't connect, or there's a login failure, or there's a poor quality of display, or maybe even randomly disconnected session. How many of you have seen the kind of PCROP black screen of death? Right? Yeah, common one. So we'll cover that today. And this is one of our very unhappy users, by the way.
On a good day.
On a good day. So, failure to communicate, where to look. So if you do have a kind of client connectivity issue, one of the first things you can actually look at is in the connection broker logs. Now, on a Windows 2008 server, you can see this is where the logs are maintained in this area here. And the things to look for is when the client initially tries to connect to the connection server, what the connection server will actually log an attempt by that client to connect to the connection server. And we see that here in that it's requesting the configuration from the connection server. And so when the client connects, the broker will send back its configuration, such as the Active Directory domains that the user can connect to. The user will then type in their username and password, and then they'll click connect, and we'll see this broker authentication message where we can see that Matt Coppinger here is attempting to authenticate into this domain here, Future Office. So there you can see that actually the connection server did receive a request from a client and someone is attempting to authenticate. So you know that they got beyond the username and password login piece. Then it'll tell me whether or not I was successfully authenticated to my environment. And we actually have an audit event here that identifies the user's SID for this particular user. And this is important in that what we're doing here is we're matching the session ID, the user SID, and the username so that we can actually start correlating those events. So in Beartail, I'll cut and paste that particular information, start highlighting so that in the logs I can see exactly what happened to that user's specific session. And in the event database, so we post the key events to an event database, which you can obviously track as well. Once the user is logged in, you'll see this broker user logged in event. So let's talk about some of those user experience issues. And we talked about the black screen of death. Okay, and this is typically where either something's happened around the client being able to connect, the client PCROP component being able to connect to the PCROP component on the View agent. Okay, and that particular component is called the PCROP server. That sits on the virtual desktop and is part of our View agent component. Now, typically when you see a black screen of death, this means that the client cannot connect to the virtual desktop. And typically this is because of the fact that the TCP and UDP ports for PCROP 4172 has not been opened on the firewall. The other issue could be that the fact that someone has overwritten the display driver on the virtual desktop and is basically, we don't have the correct PCROP bits on the virtual desktop. And you'll see this in the PCROP server logs, which sit on the View agent, and you'll see these particular issues. So, if there was some kind of firewall port issue, you'll see this connection timed out. And if there was an issue with the particular display driver, you'll see this SVGA DevTap error come up.
90% of the time when you have a black screen of death issue, it's going to be because the UDP stream is not able to finish. You're able to connect into the desktop because everything else is set up correctly, but PC over IP, both the TCP and the UDP stream are not able to communicate correctly. a lot of firewall admins will add the TCP port, but not the UDP port. And that's 90% of the time why a black screen of death is happening. Now, a lot of times, there's some other particular issues that I thought I'd call out just in case you might have heard of them or may not have. One of the particulars about PC over IP is it's a real-time protocol. And so if you have any sort of devices on your network that like to manage traffic and do things with the packets in order to maybe optimize them, that can be a problem for PC over IP because it interprets any packet reordering as loss. Even though it's not actual loss, and your network admin will say, there's no loss, we're not having any packet loss. But PC over IP will interpret that as packet loss because it expects all packets to arrive in the order that they were sent. And if they're not, then it says, nope, I want you to send them again. And so that's another common issue that we see along with the PC over IP type of drops and issues like that.
And if you are using, if you are providing external access into View and using either the security server or connection server for that, it's important you configure the external URL. And if you incorrectly configure this, it will also mean that the user won't be able to connect to the, from outside to the connection server and have their connection forwarded onto the virtual desktop. So we talked about, I mean, Jack quickly covered kind of poor quality display and what's happening here, and that's usually because of typically packet loss or not enough bandwidth available for the PCRP protocol. And you can actually see that happening in the PCRP server logs on the virtual desktop, and you'll see this, let's see if I can get it working here. No, but you'll see it here from in the logs, this loss, okay, and it's basically saying there that it's PCRP has identified that there's some packet loss in the logs, and actually when it sees the packet loss, it will start to reduce the amount of bandwidth that PCRP will use. PCRP is an adaptive protocol, so it will change the amount of bandwidth the session is using, and you can see here it's reduced the bandwidth from 234 down to 176. So by looking at the particular virtual desktop logs, you can identify if someone's having poor user experience from these specific events. We also see randomly disconnected sessions. How many of you have seen that in a View environment where suddenly the user just gets disconnected? Well, a common one here, in fact, is that it's not so random, that the disconnection actually happens after around about 15 minutes. And this occurs because essentially the user connects into the virtual desktop, but the session manager on the virtual desktop hasn't been able to communicate the session state information to the connection broker. So the connection broker is not aware that the user is running on that desktop. Now there's a timeout period of about 15 minutes, so if the connection server doesn't get that updated session information, it just assumes that no one is on that virtual desktop and will kill the connection. And that's what happens when the user actually gets disconnected. And so you'll see this in the logs, you'll see this pending expired in the logs. And this is sometimes caused by, particularly in Windows XP, if you are kind of daisy chaining the GINA and you've got applications that want to launch on login. We use that for our View agent, and if you interrupt that process, the View agent, the session manager process won't launch, and therefore it doesn't connect to the connection server and doesn't update the state information. So let's talk about domain number 2, which is desktop not available. And this is really around kind of provisioning issues or something that's happening where the desktop hasn't been able to initialize correctly and connect, its information over to, pass this information to the connection server. And again, we're looking in the connection broker logs and the event database. And specifically what we're looking for here is whether or not when the client connected to the connection server, if a pool of desktops was returned to that client. So once they've authenticated, the next thing that should happen is within their View client, they should get a list of desktops that are available to them. And you can understand and see if this actually happened for your client, your user, by this particular information here. So I've got the user's session ID and seeing whether or not a pool of desktops was returned to that user. And you can see here that a pool was returned, or at least a number of desktops was identified for that particular user. So we know that they have an entitlement within View, and that pool was returned to the client. So then they have a list of desktops. The next thing the client does is they choose their desktop and they click, connect. So the next thing we'll see is this broker desktop request in the event database, and then we'll see that the broker will attempt to allocate a virtual desktop session to the user. So you can see here that it has identified a desktop for the user that will be allocated. Now the desktop here is identified using this CN here, and it's actually in an OU called servers. That doesn't make sense, right? Because that's a desktop that we're talking about here. But actually, desktops in a View kind of LDAP schema perspective are stored in an OU called servers, which isn't very helpful, but you should be aware of that. So then we get this message here that we've allocated allocated a VM to the user, this gold non-persistent pool, and the pools are stored under applications, okay? And then we get this event database thing that says broken machine has been allocated. And we're able to find a free desktop and pass it on to the user. So once a session has been allocated, the connection server will then attempt to single sign on the user into the desktop. And this is even before the user has actually even connected via piece over IP onto the virtual desktop. So it's the connection server that is taking the authentication information and authenticating the user on the desktop. And you'll see this log here in the connection broker logs, my session ID, and I'm using SSO for this particular domain. If you don't see that, you know that the user has not been logged in. So they're probably sat at the Microsoft login prompt on the virtual desktop session.
So as Matt was mentioning, we have some particulars about the View configuration that's stored on a View broker. And one of the tools we want to make sure you understand how to use, because it's built into Windows 2008, is ADSI and ADSI Edit. This is actually the domain infrastructure tool that you could use to play with your Active Directory infrastructure, but we use it to actually look at our schema for View as well. And we have some great documentation on how to look at a number of things, but we wanted to call out some of the things that you could actually do. And in this particular slide, you can see that this desktop has been allocated based on this attribute. You can see, I can't even read it over here.
IP host number.
Yeah, the IP host number. So there's a lot of attributes, but as Matt mentioned, the server groups and servers are the names that we're actually looking at, which is a little counterintuitive to what's actually the name. So for a desktop, those are going to be stored under servers. The pools will be under server groups as well as applications. So make sure you understand the differences between the terminology we use in the configuration as well as what they're actually tied to.
So if you're not familiar, we use basically ADLDS to store all of our configuration information for View. So you can use this tool to connect to that LDAP directory and actually look at how View is configured today and all the user entitlements. So what we've done here is, in the previous slide, you saw that I was allocated a specific desktop, but it was a CN name. So I can actually now go into ADSI Edit, use a query to look up that CN name, and then find out further information about that particular VM. Find out the desktop information, which you can see here.
So these are actually some of the attributes that we wanted to pull out for you to be aware of, because these are very, very helpful when you're looking for particular information. The display name is going to be the actual name of the desktop, the virtual desktop. One of the new features and one of the latest releases of View is this idea of a dirty VM. If you are in a non-persistent type of pool and you don't want VMs to be reused, you want to make sure they're clean every time. If a VM's been used, then it can actually be dirty, and so there's an attribute to tell whether one is dirty or not. Now, you might have seen an already used state in View. This is an attribute that's tied to that, so we like to bring that out. Also, the snapshot, the VM path, where you can find those in terms of the vCenter infrastructure. These are attributes that if you're trying to understand why a desktop is not working correctly or trying to just track down a particular desktop, these are attributes that are key for that. And I believe, go ahead and go to the next slide. I believe the next one, this is an actual query that we have that you can look for a VM by a particular name. So I put two queries up here to assist you finding a VM with one particular snapshot. So if you are in a situation where you have a pool that is using multiple snapshots at the same time, perhaps you're doing a recompose in stages. This is valuable to track all the desktops and find all the ones that may be on a particular snapshot still. Or if you just need to find a particular troubled desktop so that you can see all of its individual attributes. This is a second query, and you can see the actual query window in ADSI Edit. It's just a right-click operation, very simple to do, but sometimes the language of the queries is a little difficult to pin down if you're not very familiar with this process. Again, we do have great documentation on the KB site, but here's just one of those queries in action to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like when you're actually doing this process.
Okay, so let's carry on. So we've actually had our session allocated to the user, and the user has now been authenticated into the desktop. And so our session will start on the desktop, and you can see on the broker that it's requested that a start session be initialized on the View agent. So the agent will then respond and says, I understand I got the start session message, and I will start now to launch a session within the virtual desktop, which will then kick off all of the PCRP bits to allow the client to formally connect. And you'll see that in the event database, when the session starts up, you'll see this agent pending, and you'll see that this start session has been completed, and then you'll see another log event from the desktop tracker that the user is now connected to that particular desktop. And when that happens, you'll see that this PCRP within the client, you'll see an acknowledgement that the PCRP session has started, and then you'll get, whether it's PCRP or RDP, you'll get this WTS session logon event within the client. And finally, within the event database, you'll see agent connected. So these are the things that you definitely have to see within the logs if you want to know whether or not a client actually got a connection into the desktop and can see what's going on within the desktop. So PCRP is connected and up and running.
Another place you can look is the event database. This gets overlooked a lot by customers that when they call our global support, and one of the first things that we're going to go look at is the event database. And if a lot of customers just don't even set it up, but it's if you already have a SQL server or another server, database server that you have available, I highly recommend that you make this part of your setup process. And if you've already set it up and you haven't touched the event database, I highly recommend you go back and add it, because it doesn't take a lot of space and it gives you a lot of information, similar to what we talked about using Beartail to help filter out. This is a great tool, to actually go in and actually look at the events and a lot of the audit information that we get in View. And if you're SQL savvy and you can write some queries, this information is kept raw in this database. And while we don't, we always advocate to be careful when you're working directly with the database. If you have the know-how to do some queries, there's a lot of information that's in this database that isn't necessarily in your face when you're looking in the View Manager. There's a lot of attributes that get tied to events that we actually log, but they don't really jump out at you when you're looking in the View Administrator. So if you have the ability to do direct SQL queries, you can use this to actually go in and mine some good data. And there's Chris Hallstad is a guy who on Twitter, he sent me a message, and he wrote a great utility that actually will monitor events based on this. It will do direct queries and monitor and pop up alerts and things like that. Those are the kinds of things that you can do with this information if you have the ability to access it. So I highly recommend that if you have the ability to use SQL Management Studio to go in there and look, you'll find there's a lot of information that you might find useful for monitoring as well as troubleshooting.
Setting up an event database is an option. How many of you are using the event database in your View deployments today? Okay. And how many of you are actively, proactively monitoring the events in the SQL database?
Yeah.
Okay. So just a few. So absolutely, I think there are some tools out there to actively monitor that. So, check that out. And one of the other things actually we didn't mention around tools is if you go onto the the VM Labs or Fling site, we actually have a couple of tools for View where it allows you actually to collect the logs across a View environment. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's that URL?
Sorry?
What's that URL?
We'll put it up at the end there on the resources. Yeah.
labs.vmware.com/flings.
Okay, so another issue, of course, is pool provisioning. So, we might have an issue where there might not actually be any desktops available to provide to that user. And we typically see this possibly when, we've either run out of disk space or there's some kind of, storage, or there's some kind of customization issue. So what we'll see actually, obviously in the View Administrator, you'll see this quite easily because the pool status will be red and there might be, a flag saying, check the data store capacity. But in the event database, you can look for broker provisioning error, and there's a whole bunch of errors that are actually listed under there. And you can also, of course, check the event database, but in one of the common issues that we see is that View Composer, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't have access to the ESX hosts. So you should also check the network connectivity there. If View Composer cannot connect to the ESX host, it won't be deploying View desktops. The other one that we see is sometimes the customization. So even though the VM has been deployed in vCenter, the actual customization process gets interrupted in some way. And you can see that when you check the desktop status in the administration console and see the agent unavailable. And that basically means that the customization hasn't happened, and therefore the agent cannot connect to the connection server. And we can see things like, maybe there were not enough ports on the vSwitch setup. That's a very kind of typical one where maybe a network admin has reduced the number of ports available on the vSwitch. You spin up 120 odd desktops, and of course the desktops can't actually get a port, they can't get an IP address, and therefore the View agent can't connect to the connection server. So that's a common one. But of course in the View dashboard, the administrator console, you'll see these kind of problem desktops are particularly highlighted up in the top left corner of the dashboard, and so you should check that out. One of the other things that's absolutely important in the View environment is your DNS and AD connectivity, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So one of the common problems, how many of you seen the already used status on your View desktops in the administration console? And this has been a common problem really recently, and this has happened on kind of floating pool or non-persistent type desktops, where actually you have a kind of refresh on log off or delete on used desktops, where once they're used we're trying to blow them away and they get reprovisioned. But sometimes what happens is that the actual deleting of the desktop doesn't occur, or it does occur but the broker never receives an explicit kind of logout message from the agent. So maybe the session got, the VM got deleted, but it was so quick that the connection server wasn't aware of that. So it just sits there saying, I know it's already been used, but it's not been logged out, and it just sits there as already used. And you'll see this in this kind of, there won't be a missing agent. Yep. So it'll be an agent ended will be missing from the event database for that particular VM.
Just to add something quick to that, there is a way to dictate how this problem gets dealt with. It's not highly documented, but it is in the release notes, and there's an attribute that you can set on a pool basis to tell the broker how to actually deal with this problem, whether you want it to keep the VMs in that state, whether you want it just go ahead and delete it and just forget about it, or I believe the other option is to just do it as we used to and keep it in already used. So if you go read the release notes for I believe 5.2, it's in there. So this is something that we added. It's just some people ran into it more than others, and so we put a small fix there for that.
So the classic mistake, of course, is you set up accounts for View Connection Server to use for vCenter, or even View Composer to use to register desktops on a domain. And you should always check whether these accounts actually work. So what we like to do is when we set up a View environment, we'll manually check some of the things that View will need to do. So we'll log into vCenter and make sure that we can provision a desktop. We'll try and add that desktop to the domain using the service account for View Composer. And you must check these things, because often we see, people, have a service account or something set up for View Composer, but it doesn't actually have the rights to put the desktop onto the domain. And you'll see here, this is the error you'll see in the logs where it failed for the domain join in the View Composer logs because access is denied. And what it's saying is that your credentials are, don't have the rights, your username, your service account doesn't have rights within Active Directory to add that desktop to the domain. So please make sure you manually check those things, and as you go along and you're operating and managing your View environment, that no one's going in and kind of deleting the accounts or removing rights from those accounts. So the next domain is the broken broker. So we've talked about client connectivity issues, we've talked about provisioning issues, but sometimes there might be issues within the broker where specific components have an issue. And this typically can involve things like connectivity to vCenter, View Composer issues, JMS issues, which is the message bus system we use for the components to talk to each other, or maybe an AD replication issue for our internal directory service.
So one of the easy things that you can do that I wanted to make sure that you were aware of is on a Windows 2008 server, just like with ADSI Edit, we have a lot of replication administration tools. This is one that's built in, Rep Admin. It's used to check the replication topology of an Active Directory forest or domain group, and we can use this same tool to check the replication status of a cluster of brokers. Because we use that same underlying technology to replicate our configuration amongst brokers, this is an easy tool that you can actually use to check if you might have had a broker that has gotten out of sync with the rest. This doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen on occasion for customers, especially when you have a large environment with many brokers that have a lot of configuration that they have to move around. So this is a utility that's built into Windows, and this is the actual command line you can run up here to check the current status of the replicated objects in that group and see what the current status is. So just another kind of quick tip on something you can check if you're having brokers that are acting funny because they don't necessarily think that they're part of the group. You can get on that broker, run this command, and actually check to see what it thinks the actual topology looks like.
And this is really important because what we're doing with in a multi-connection server deployment scenario, which we obviously recommend for redundancy's sake, where you've got a connection server and a replica, is that they're sharing configuration information using ADLDS or ADAM. So they're actually broadcasting to each other any configuration changes that are happening within the environment. So if that replication doesn't happen, you're going to have inconsistent states on each of your connection servers where there might be conflicting information around configuration. So this is really important. We're not talking about your Active Directory here. We're talking about replication of configuration information for our own ADLDS instance within View itself. So obviously vCenter server connectivity is really important. If View cannot connect to vCenter, it cannot power on VMs and it cannot provision VMs. However, I will state if vCenter server goes down, your users should still be able to connect. If your virtual desktops are powered on and available, your users should still be able to connect into that virtual desktop. However, it's important to have vCenter server up and running so you can do all your power and provisioning operations. Now within the event database, you'll see these VC down events. Okay, and obviously in the admin UI, you'll see that red status.
We have some resiliency towards this, much more in the latest versions of View than in older versions with the use of caching. But this is a problem that can occur with the communication. If it goes down, that will cause issues. But you probably won't see it as much in the most recent versions, but it still can happen if you have any sort of communication issues.
So View Composer is obviously a critical component if you're using link clones, and we often see VMs kind of stuck in deleting status. How many of you have seen that in your View environment, right? It's a pretty common one. Yeah. So we actually, unfortunately, there's a bit of a kind of convoluted process for sorting that out, but we have some great documentation on it. But really what happens is sometimes obviously the virtual machines get stuck, or sometimes someone might have manually deleted a VM. And this can happen particularly if you have admins hitting vCenter and they're thinking, well, what's this desktop VM doing? And they'll just delete it. And all of a sudden View freaks out and says, hang on, someone's deleted the virtual desktop. Now the problem is that View can see that it's gone, but no one's deleted it out of View Composer. And so when View Composer then tries to re-provision that VM, because it's the connection server said, hey, the VM's gone, View Composer re-provision that VM, View Composer says, well, hang on, my database, I've still got information about that VM, so I'm not going to re-provision it because it already exists. So then you have to go and clean out the Composer database, right? So the database in Composer and VC gets out of sync. And this is what we call kind of, orphan VMs. So we've got a great KB article here, 20151112, and that talks about how you can manually go in and clean up View Composer. And I think actually Jack will dive into that in a minute. We also we use JMS to communicate between the components within View. Now this is where we're actually communicating kind of ephemeral information, okay, non-persistent information. So session state information, live information is communicated from each VM to all of the connection servers. So if you can imagine, we've got thousands of VMs running in your environment, they're communicating this information every few seconds. We need a very fast communication component to make sure that all that information gets out to the correct components. Now, one of the things in View is, of course, we don't support split View clusters. So you can't put a View connection server in one data center and a replica connection server in another data center because of this, because we use JMS, and JMS is very latency intolerant. So if there's any latency on the network, the communication between the connection servers when using JMS gets interrupted. And because that's live session state information, that means that essentially, not all of the correct state information is getting communicated out. So we we can see some really kind of funky situations here where connection servers think that VMs are not available or they haven't been provisioned, and they kind of start to act independently. So it's really important that you keep your View connection servers in one data center. Now, if you wanted a multi-data center deployment of View, we support kind of load balancing with something like F5, load balancing between those two instances, but they're separate instances of View. Now, you'll see in the View dashboard, you'll see a red status on one of the components, and this could be because of JMS. Now, in the connection server logs, you'll see these rejoin or resync messages, which indicate whether or not there's a communication failure for JMS. I forget what's the port that JMS uses again? Is it
4001?
4001? 4001.
Yeah. So, yeah, with the ADLDS instance, it's critical to understand the relationship between View Composer, ADLDS, and Active Directory. These all work together to make sure that we have a synchronization of objects between what the desktops that we're creating, the user information that we're using. So I just wanted to quickly show this relationship and how they communicate with each other. If you have a problem where you've gotten to a situation like Matt was describing, where maybe an administrator, a second administrator, has deleted some desktops, it's okay to go clean this up and not just throw in the white towel and give up. And so the next two slides are essentially talking about how that process looks like. The most important thing is backup. You need to make sure you back up. And when I say backup, not just View, we have a lot of components in play here. So that's why we need to look at this relationship. We need to make sure that we back up the ADLDS configuration, the persistent configuration. We need to also make sure that we back up the View Composer database. So those components are, if they're out of sync when we try to do a restore, some weird things can happen. So the process, just very quickly, and again, the KB site is great for this, but we want to just kind of give you the overview of how this process looks. And one of the key things that some people have struggled with is at the very end, in terms of unprotecting a replica. Because if you need to delete an entire pool that's using a snapshot, it's going to have a replica, and that's going to be protected in vCenter from being deleted. So you have to actually unprotect it. So a common thing is if someone isn't maybe in a POC, and they just wipe away the whole instance, this utility will be wiped away with it. So you need to make sure you clean up things before you uninstall and start over, if you plan to do that. But part of bringing this process to light is that you don't have to uninstall and start over. You can simply clean things up and clean up a pool, or even clean up all your pools, and be able to redeploy without having to impact production necessarily. So this is one of the queries, and we always say proceed with extreme caution. I like to bring it out because people get afraid of doing these things, but I want to make sure that you understand it's totally possible, if you take the right precautions to clean up things. And this is the actual query, so be very careful if you try to do this kind of work. Again, this is going to require SQL access, but this is how you would go through and delete one particular VM. This is also another query on how you would delete all VMs and pools. If you just something's really gotten astray in your environment, and you just need to go ahead and clean them all up, but you don't want to uninstall View, and you don't want to have to reset all the config, your administrators, your users, things like that. This is a good way to go clean up the VMs, the pools, or just one particular problem desktop if you've gotten into a situation where it's gotten deleted out from underneath you. So we put this in for your reference, so if you need this, go get the deck. We'll have all this. You can grab it and use it to your use.
So the final problem domain is performance issues. So you might get a user call up and say, hey, my desktop's really slow. And this is, obviously we've all over the years now come to understand, that storage I/O is extremely important within a VDI deployment. So usually most performance issues are related to some kind of storage I/O bottleneck. But it can also be caused by memory contention, CPU contention, or possibly even network issues such as PCRP, as we mentioned earlier. So of course you can use typical tools such as vCenter or ESX, Top for example, to check out some of the key and critical data points for looking at performance on vSphere. Now this isn't a vSphere performance troubleshooting session, so it's just a quick look at some of the key things that we would look at. Obviously CPU utilization on the host or the cluster should be less than 90%. VM utilization, you need to look at percent used within ESX Top. And the percent ready time is very important. It must be below 10 in ESX top. Memory utilization, again, less than 85%. And looking and making sure that your VM's not, consuming a lot of memory. We can see that sometimes if people are running Java-based applications within the virtual desktop, that they can consume a lot of memory because they're using Java, and Java has its own kind of memory management systems in place where we can't, swap that memory out. So just keep an idea on that. Swapping and ballooning levels on ESX. And then finally, of course, storage. Disk read latency is super important in a VDI environment. You need to make sure you check that. And here are just some of the things within ESX top that you would check.
So this is a query that an actual script that you can run in ESX. Something that I like to share with people is if you have performance at odd times, such as night, or you're a 24-hour company, but your administrators are only 9 to 5, this is a great script that you can use to run performance snapshots in your ESX host, and that's the actual script that you can run. And so I put the parameters as well as the script in there. This is great if you want to grab that snapshot of your performance during a certain time frame and then be able to replay it in ESX and look at the numbers live, from a previous time. This is really handy to be able to give to our support guys as well. So, this is a quick script for your reference. I highly recommend you use it if you're in that type of scenario.
You just added a few slides in here for your reference, really, just quickly quick reference. I mean, it's a bit of an eye chart. You're not going to look at it right now, but something you can look at, just some quick guidance on some of the key areas, some of the key stats in ESX top that you can look at for CPU, memory, and storage there. But really, troubleshooting View is really changing in our environment. And what we're seeing now is being able to use something like vCenter Operations Manager and vCenter Operations Manager for View has really changed the game when it comes to troubleshooting. This is a product that you can use now to actually quickly identify some of the key performance issues in your environment. And we really like it. We use it a lot internally. And in fact, you can download and use a free trial for 60 days and put this into maybe your own environment or a customer's environment and use it to quickly get a feel for what's going on across storage, networking, and compute. And so, we can do things like, you can look at throughput, you can look at latency, etc. I mean, there's so many stats in how many of you are familiar with vCenter Operations Manager? Okay, great. How many of you are using it with the View adapter piece that actually starts to pull? Okay, great. So, the View adapter actually pulls in things like users, pools, PCRP stats are sat on the client. It looks at network latency between the client and the connection server. So there's a load of kind of View-specific information that it collects and actually presents in them some very nice dashboards. And
in the latest version, the agent adapter is already built in. So, if you're deploying the latest View agent, it's very easy to implement.
So we've got a little demo here of, this is the kind of dashboard that you might use within View. You can see it's got a heat map. And what I'm doing here is actually putting in a kind of username, typing in a username, so just doing a query on a user. Again, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a eye chart here. And you can see immediately, once I type in the user, it brings up the virtual desktop and host information, storage information for that specific user. So immediately it's identified that here are some of the key statistics. I'm looking at virtual machine memory here, and I can start to see, just by typing in the username, all of the different infrastructure components that link to that particular user and their experience. And I've got a whole number of different things I can drill down in here, so I can look at memory, CPU, I can look at the PCRP stats for that particular session. So these are things where I can just, reactively go in and see what's going on. But the great thing about VCOPS is that it learns over time what's normal. So it actually will start to predict, and it has some trends. It will look at the kind of trend, and if you start to veer away from that trend, you can start firing off alerts, particularly around things like, data store read latency, for example, is a good one, where it actually starts to alert you before it even happens. So if it starts to see that you're deviating away from what's normal in your environment, it'll say, hang on, something different is happening, and ping you on that. So it's a very, very powerful tool, and hopefully some of you at the keynote this morning would have seen some of that stuff in action.
It allows you to be proactive instead of just completely reactive. It's highly recommended.
And here you can just see some other information that we've got here, kind of an overview of a virtual desktop there, looking at memory and CPU usage and things like that.
Something that we don't actually have a video for that I think we should add maybe for the next time is another new product that we have at VMware called Log Insight. Have anyone heard of the Log Insight? Yeah, great. It's a great. We're working on the actual content pack for View. I've been working with that team directly. We're trying to really get that up, to be really solid. You can actually use it now. There's some tips and tricks, so be looking for that. The product is there, but we're trying to get it to where we can use that as a View troubleshooting tool as well, to be a central log gatherer.
So we're hoping next year when we do this presentation again is that actually this content would have transformed. It would have all been about using Log Insight and using vCops to kind of troubleshoot and manage your View environment.
Yep.
But today, what we're looking at is diving into the logs and trying to help you guys, feel a little bit more comfortable when you're looking at the logging and the events that are happening in a View environment. So here are the areas you can get help. Obviously check the KB site, check the community site. How many of you are familiar with support.bat, that little batch file that runs on the connection server? Right. It's actually very cool just to run that in your environment. It runs a whole bunch of tests. It zips all the data up into a little zip file. Open that up and you can actually see some status and information about your environment and actually give you a nice feel for the kind of information that we collect and look at when we start to troubleshoot information from a global support perspective. And obviously, if you do get stuck, submit a support request. So just to summarize, we've gone through the different problem domains, the areas where we see common issues in View. Hopefully you understand those different problem areas. We've looked at the different components. We've looked at the logging and the key events that should happen in your environment when a client connects to the connection server. And we've taken you through the logs, where they are, and we'll also look at some of the key performance metrics that you should be looking at on ESX and vCenter. So I think we're actually kind of out of time. Jack and I will actually take some questions outside if you've got some. So apologies for running a little bit late. Hope you enjoyed the session. I hope everyone got something from it. So thank you for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
And enjoy VMworld.